Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the First Principle podcast. And I'm very excited to finally bring this to you because since the start of our TikTok community back in early August, there's been a lot of people asking for more in-depth version of the analysis that we've done in our short 60-second TikTok videos. And this is our first episode of the podcast. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to the community who have supported the content and the project this far. It is impossible to get to this point without your support. And also, I want to thank the patrons on my Patreon, Fax, Chad, Mark, and Lydia for being early supporters. So in this episode, I just first want to give a brief summary of a brief abstract of what's going to happen, what we're going to talk about. So right now we have, in our TikTok videos, we have touched on a number of very hot, sensitive subjects and topics that have been covered in our mainstream media over this year so far. And there have been a lot of questions and controversies for sure in many of those topics. And there's also a lot of commonalities, and those topics range from geopolitics, technological competition, as well as cultural conflicts, and where combined together, where the combination of all of those problems and controversies is going to lead the world after the current pandemic that we're still in. So in this part, in this live stream and in this video, we're going to briefly go over some of the core issues that I think underlie the main trend that we are seeing right now in 2020. And this video is a live stream, but also afterwards, the video will be available in this YouTube channel for your reference. And also there will be a lot of references to articles, studies, and news reports during the making of this video. So, but don't worry, all of the references, article links will be provided in the video description. I will add them to the video description afterwards. So you have access to all of them. So don't worry about that. And at the end of this, I will answer. And in the middle of this video, I will briefly touch on a few subjects and go into each of them in a very in-depth way. Just for the shorthand, we are going to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and clarify a lot of things that have been distorted and also presented in a very binary and biased way so far in the mainstream media report, predominantly in the English media. And then we're going to talk about the other events that have happened over the years simultaneously as the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we can all agree that one of the core issues we've seen in the media, even just more recently, is the Mulan movie boycott controversy that have stirred a lot of attention in not just on TikTok, but pretty much everywhere, from Hollywood to mainstream media. So, and that is very related to the Xinjiang problem, the situation we have in Western China, in the Xinjiang autonomous region, in terms of the situation of the Uyghurs. And that aside, we also have the ongoing issue in Hong Kong that's been going on for at least the past 2 years, and is gradually drawing to a close at the moment. But the commonality between these two issues is that that China, as the main participant, as the main commonality of these two events, have mostly been the one that's put in a negative light. And in terms of the international media coverage, there is basically very little, close to zero voice presenting their perspective. And as you will see later, there's a lot of willful neglect of facts that actually oppose the dominant image presented by English and Western media against China in both of these two issues. And at the same time, in 2020, there is an ongoing trade war, and as an extension of that, an ongoing technological war between the US and China. And in the midst of all this, and there seems to be a gradual transition globally in terms of economics and trade, gradually from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And that major transition, as we'll talk about later, will mark it seems to be the mark of a change that's not happened over the past 200 years. And the significance of that transition and the change and the implications of that underlie a lot of the issues that we will be talking about in this in this live stream. So, okay, without further ado, let's get started. The first topic concerns the COVID-19 pandemic. Essentially, the COVID-19 pandemic was, as most of us have seen the TED Talk done by Bill Gates about 2 to 3 years ago on the future major threat to humanity. And that is a virus-triggered pandemic that's going to wreak havoc, not just in a specific region, but globally. And that is because in our current globalized economy, there is very little way of protecting the humanity as a whole from just one epidemic that started in one single region. And the reason is although locally there can be a lot of measures and healthcare monitoring done by the local and state government, but internationally, the surveillance and monitoring mechanisms are still very lacking. And the example we saw was the Ebola crisis epidemic that started in West Africa a few years ago. And that largely was contained at the joint effort by the joint effort of WTO, the World Health Organization, as well as the member states that paid attention to the epidemic. And if you remember, back during the Ebola crisis, there were video screening at the airport at all times. There were temperature monitoring at airport entrances, at airport customs, in almost every major airport in the world, international airports. And the reason why, and that was pretty much the major measure, the major monitoring measure taken by the different governments. And the reason why that was pretty much an effective measure sufficient for combating and preventing the spread of the Ebola epidemic was that the symptoms of that virus contraction was very clear. That fever is very obvious among the virus stricken population. So when you just have the monitoring, the temperature monitoring machines installed in airport customs, that is relatively easy to monitor. But however, although humanity as a whole enjoyed the epidemic of Ebola, the current epidemic, COVID-19, is very different. That is, we did not underestimate the threat of Ebola a few years ago. But what we seem to have done in terms of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic is that a lot of governments around the world have in a very curious way, contrary to what they did during the Ebola crisis, underestimated the threat of COVID-19, the threat of the new SARS virus. So that is a very interesting contrast between what humanity did this year to combat COVID-19 and what we did as a collective whole to combat the Ebola epidemic. And the reason for the difference, for the underestimation of the threat of the COVID-19 pandemic, is actually very interesting. There is currently no major. There are two major distinctions that marked the current COVID-19 pandemic. The first distinction is the country of origin, the region of origin of the virus in Ebola vis-a-vis COVID-19. And the second distinction is the infectiousness as well as the symptoms of the two different viruses. Well, in terms of Ebola, the region of origin was in Africa, and because the local healthcare infrastructure in the African countries is not generally as good as well prepared as the healthcare systems in more advanced economies, the casualties of the virus was very deadly. And also because there was a lot of international aid, there's still a lot of international aid to the local healthcare industries in those parts of Africa. The communication mechanisms established as a result of the international aid relatively made the rest of the world informed on the issue. And the second and the symptom part of the Ebola crisis was that, like mentioned earlier, the symptoms were very easy to detect, easier compared to the COVID-19 pandemic. But in terms of COVID-19, these two factors are very different from what happened during the Ebola crisis. In terms of COVID-19, the current scientific estimate of the origin place of the virus is in central China, in the city called Wuhan in Hubei province, a metropolis with a population of about 50 million people. So the country of origin is in China, and the symptoms and the infectiousness of the virus, of the SARS-CoV-19, are very different from that of Ebola. With COVID-19, the infectiousness is very high, but the main difference is that the symptoms can be very implicit, the symptoms require more than temperature monitoring machines installed at the airport to detect. The symptoms are also very mild compared to the Ebola crisis, which actually exacerbates the infectiousness of the disease, because with very mild symptoms for a lot of people, we can easily underestimate the threat of the virus. So the nature of these two viruses are very different. Let's get into the first factor of the differences between these two viruses. In terms of the country of origin, like I said earlier, the origin place of Africa has always been a focal point of international aid. So mostly as a result of the humanitarian effort of different governments as well as NGOs. But China is a very different kind of origin compared to Africa. Well, first of all, China was stricken by a SARS virus before, and in early 2000s. And during that SARS virus, China did not respond with a perfect score sheet. Initially, the local government in southern China tried to cover it up, not informing the central government. Because in China, the political system is structured very interestingly. The Chinese political system can be broadly divided into two layers. The local government, that is the provincial, the municipal, and the lower tranches of the government, and the central government, that is the one located in Beijing. These two layers of government constitute the major two primary forces in the tug of war of the power dynamics in the Chinese political system. So usually, the local government what the local government officials try to do is to meet the economic development indicators and meet the other indicators of social prosperity, meet the industrial development indicators, and as well as, so for example, healthcare, education, poverty alleviation. So whenever there is a crisis that may occur in any point of these more local levels of government, the first natural response of the officials would be try to reduce the overall impact of the potential crisis, so that the performance of the local government in terms of those indicators, economically, politically, culturally, education-wise, healthcare-wise, poverty alleviation-wise, will have the minimal impact, will be minimally impacted. That would be their first reflex to deal with any crisis. And it was only usually considered the last resort to call for help from the central government. And that's exactly what's happened in the SARS crisis in the early 2000s, because the local government in southern China, in the province, tried to cover it up, not informing the central government. As a result, more casualties were created as a result of the initial cover-up. But once the central government was informed, they quickly mobilized national resources from all parts of China to combat the virus. That's how the political system in China works. That once there is a national crisis, resources can be mobilized very quickly. And we have seen some of that in the Wuhan fight against COVID-19. But so China did not come into this current COVID-19 pandemic with a clean sheet, with a perfect score from the previous test of SARS. In the current test, the international response, largely obviously with controversy over how exactly it's measured, China seems to have done a lot better in terms of curbing this current SARS virus, both in terms of maintaining a low level of infectiousness despite the very infectious nature of the disease, of the virus. Also, it informed the international community very quickly. After the discovery of the virus in two of the Wuhan local hospitals in late December. It was in early January, I think it was January the 5th, that the World Health Organization was informed. And very, very quickly after that, about a week or two or so, the genetic sequence of the virus was completed by the Chinese scientists and also shared with the rest of the world for study. And so in terms of the transparency of the Chinese government, central government in combating the COVID-19, the performance and the result is very different compared to what happened in the early 2000s. But there was an event that drew international attention with regard to the death of a Wuhan local doctor, Wenliang, who posted on December the 31st, first on WeChat and then on Weibo, the two major Chinese social media platforms, to inform his colleagues and friends that there's a pneumonia-like new disease, potentially caused by a new SARS virus. And on December the 31st, soon after December the 31st, after he posted the information on Weibo, he was informed by the local police station in Wuhan and was accused of misspreading information. So as a result of that, that was largely presented and viewed as an attempt of the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese government to impose censorship on Chinese scientists and doctors, and was largely viewed by the international community as the cause of the havoc that the COVID-19 virus later wreaked on the rest of the world. The logic is as follows. If Dr. Li Wenliang's words were taken seriously, had Dr. Li Wenliang's words been taken seriously by the Chinese government, the rest of the world would not have suffered, would not have needed to suffer from the casualties and the economic consequent impact of the global pandemic. That's the logic from a few Western countries, not the whole world, but definitely from the major English-speaking countries that we regularly see in Western and English mainstream media on a daily basis. There is about two fallacies in that argument, in the logic that I just presented on behalf of the several English-speaking countries. The first is that, as I explained earlier, the Chinese government, the Chinese political system is organized very differently. The Chinese political system is organized on the local basis as well as the national basis. The police station that accused Dr. Li Wenliang of spreading misinformation was acting at the local level, and generally, the single act of local police station is not usually reported to either the provincial level or the national level. That is, the local jurisdiction is actually kept very locally administered in China. It's not like there's an emperor sitting on a throne in Beijing, monitoring and organizing every activity in the Chinese society. That's an outdated view, and it's certainly not the political and social reality in today's China. So the question here is, since that was an act of the local police station in the local jurisdiction, did the argument that had Dr. Li Wenliang's words been taken seriously by the local government of China, the world would not have needed to suffer. Here's the main and here comes to the second logical fallacy of that argument. The second logical fallacy is that the 1 day after 1 to 2 days after Dr. Li Wenliang's words were posted on the internet, there was a team sent by the national central government to Wuhan, and also the Wuhan local health monitoring and central disease control soon dispatched team to investigate the issue. So there was actually a lack of communication between the police station and the healthcare departments of the various levels of Chinese government, from the local Wuhan level to the national level. And that is, the local police district station was acting on its own without any information and communication from the disease control departments of the government. That was a problem. And if the information from the healthcare department was relayed timely to the police district station, the accusation of Dr. Li Wenliang being a spreader of misinformation would have been prevented. But regardless, the fact is the central government as well as the local officials quickly sent teams to investigate the issue, and that, as a result, led to the informing of the World Health Organization very quickly by the Chinese scientists that there is a new SARS virus in China, although the infectiousness, the symptoms, the genetic sequencing, and the mortality rates of the virus were still unknown at the time. But and after the Chinese scientists submitted the genome sequencing to the World Health Organization, there was still a huge investigation going on, as the central government of China sent a series of 3 teams of experts from the national CDC, the Chinese CDC, to Wuhan to investigate the question, is the virus transmissible human to human? is their human-to-human transmission. And in the middle of January, about on the 15th and 16th of January, the basic conclusion was reached that it was transmissible through human among the experts. But then there's still the report process of the scientists to the government, so that the government could make decisions as to what to do. But here lies the key fact. That is, in that early stage of the spread, the exact number of infected population was still unknown. And that is, when you have an unknown number of people of potentially infected, the government has no previous experience in terms of dealing with a disease that it's never encountered before. So as to what exact measure to take to contain the spread of the disease, the virus, was still a very tough decision that lacked a lot of data. But one key fact was clear, and that was the basis of the government decision to lock down Wuhan. The basis of the decision of Wuhan lockdown was based on the fact that the human traffic flow in that part of the year, just before the Chinese Spring Festival, through the megacity of 15 million people of the Wuhan metropolis at that time of the year, is bound to be huge. Tens of millions of people travel through that area of China, through airports, train station, and also many tourists in Wuhan must have, on some level, come across the virus and the disease. So although the exact number of the spread was unknown, the potential spread and this potential severity of the epidemic was something that the government had to worry about. And as a result, after about a week and a half of the reporting of the virus of the expert team sent to Wuhan, the local government and the central government locked down the city, and that was the background leading up to the Wuhan lockdown. And globally, there were two types of reaction to this, and one spoke louder than the other. The louder voice upon the lockdown of Wuhan, the mega city, was that the Chinese Communist Party willfully ignored the threat of the coronavirus, of the new coronavirus, and took unnecessary measures, draconian and stringent measures, to lock down a city, to curb human flow, to limit people's liberty and freedom to travel in the area, basically presenting it as a violation of human rights. And this type of report was mostly spearheaded by liberal media such as the New York Times and other outlets that I won't name. That was the first response, and the second response was actually coming from inside China. That there were a series of interviews conducted in China, also in Wuhan, as to what the local people thought of the lockdown. One thing to take note of was the local people actually thought the lockdown should have taken place earlier. And that is, and remember that happened, that opinion of the local public was formed before any other information was made available compared to the wealth of information that we know about the coronavirus right now. So given the uncertain basis of the exact nature of the disease, the local people thought the lockdown should have taken place maybe a week earlier, and that is right at the dispatch of the third team of national experts to Wuhan. So the Chinese reaction to the lockdown was actually quite cooperative, and hence you have these pictures that have been flowing around the American media for quite a while, for the past few months, that the Chinese, along with other East Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, are very aware of the necessity of wearing a mask, because it was confirmed very early on that it was human-to-human transmissible, and it was mainly transmitted through human fluid droplets and aerosol. So the information campaign of spreading the awareness and the knowledge of the virus was very thoroughly conducted in Chinese social media, going from Chinese version of TikTok, Douyin to Weibo, and to the media channels in China every night that report and give an update of the exact casualties and the and the infected population numbers on a daily basis. So the public information campaign was really successful in educating the people about how to prevent from catching the virus in China. However, the Western media obviously portrayed it differently, and all of that happened before the virus hit the rest of the world. First to Europe, and then North America, and then Brazil, and then India, and then now we also have Africa, of course. So that was the Chinese response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and after about a month and a half lockdown in Wuhan, starting in two month lockdown in Wuhan, starting in April, people's lives in Wuhan began to go back to normalcy. And we just recently saw, obviously, in the news that the schools in Wuhan were already reopened. And when the schools of the ground zero of the COVID-19 epidemic reopened, you know that there is basically zero threat of the virus in that part of the world, that China has, I don't want to use the word succeed, but a victory, so to speak, of overcoming the spread of the virus inside China has been remarkable. And so far, all of the cases in China over the past month, over the past 30 days, have been coming from Chinese returning from abroad back to China. That there's no natively originated, there is no local cases that have happened over the past 30 days in China. And when you know that the government has allowed schools to be reopened, you know that there should be a high level of confidence among the healthcare experts in that country, that because kids are one of the two most vulnerable populations, that of the elderly and that of the kids. So that is China's fight. And obviously the measures taken by the Chinese government, both locally and on the national level, were received with high levels of criticism in Europe and in the US. And I believe the reason for that is actually quite interesting. The reason for that is, first, if you look at the media coverage of how the Western media and English media reported on China's measures to combat the virus, you largely observe two trends. The first phenomenon is that the Western media largely mistook it as simply an authoritarian measure, an authoritarian way to combat the virus. And that was their initial response. And the second is that a lot of the media reports seem to underestimate the threat of the virus, despite that there was very little information available as to the exact infectiousness and the mortality rates of the population. So despite these two uncertain points of uncertainty, the Western media largely played it down. And that was understandable and very fair, because by that time, by March, the West, Europe and North America were largely unaffected by the COVID-19 epidemic. It was only after that they themselves also experienced the havoc and the threat and the infection of the COVID-19 epidemic that they decided to basically reverse their opinion on the measures taken by the Chinese government. As we saw very soon in Italy, starting in late February, when the infection of the epidemic began to climb very rapidly, it became the new epicenter of the coronavirus, and as China's cases began to dwindle and come to a very low level in late February. So as Italy became the new epicenter, its government also took very stringent measures in locking down cities, towns, and beaches to curb human interactions and human-to-human transmission. That happened in a Western European country. That did not happen in the authoritarian one-party state of China. And as Italy experienced very high level of threat from the coronavirus. Its European neighbors, however, did not seem to take it seriously. If you've read the French media report and the French government response to the potential threat of the COVID-19 virus in late February, all the way to the mid-March and even late March, masks weren't recommended. The word used was not even required. It was masks were not recommended by the government to the public to protect themselves. And the same thing happened in the US, that masks were simply not recommended. There are two possible explanations for that. The first is the government in Western Europe, various governments in North America as well, did underestimate the infectiousness of the disease. And that was supported by ample evidence, as in still later how they try to play it down. And the second factor was that was simply that because of the supply of masks internationally was very tight. The government in Western Europe and North America already foresaw the impending infection of the COVID-19, mass infection of COVID-19, and therefore want to preserve the number of masks that would be needed by the national healthcare workers. But regardless, it was an economic calculation that because in Italy the numbers already began to climb very rapidly, whereas the rest of Western Europe stayed largely with very low levels of infection, if they locked down too early, the local dissatisfaction with the government action would be very, very chaotic. So in a type of situation for Western European countries and North American countries, the government really has very little wiggle room to perform, because if they lock down too early, the public won't be satisfied. But if they lock down too late, which is exactly the case that happened, the public would also not be satisfied for different reasons. If they lock down too early, the public would think that government is limiting their freedom and this is a tyrannical government. But if they lock down too late, the public would also blame the government for inaction. That is the conundrum faced by Western European governments as well as North American governments. And that's exactly what happened. But the second case happened basically to every single Western European countries, as they also closed down the economy and closed down the streets on the streets of London and on the streets of Paris. As we all saw that although herd immunity was tried initially by the UK and championed by Boris Johnson and his healthcare minister, that plan was very, very quickly ditched in favor of shutting down key parts of the economy and implementing social distancing and masking measures. One could only imagine, and it was only at that point that the Western European governments and Western media stopped portraying the measures taken by the Chinese government as authoritarian and inhuman and a violation of human rights. So that was an interesting double standards going on in terms of the portrayal of the effectiveness of the different government measures to lock down key parts of the economy. But also, there's a very interesting contrast between the result of the lockdown in China and the lockdown in Western Europe and North America. That is, China opened over 90% of its economy after 2 months of lockdown. The lockdown was very comprehensive, and the public cooperative effort was maintained on a very high level, that there was this very good awareness, high level of awareness among the public to wear a mask and social distance and prevent social interactions outside. So the lockdown was stopped after 2 months, and then various parts of the Chinese economy began to resume their operations. First, pumping more mass manufacturing masks for the rest of the world, as well as for the demand in China, within China, but also resume back to normalcy in terms of the overall operations of the Chinese economy, which is the reason, and the early result of that is the reason China is being predicted by the OEDC as the only country in the world in 2020 to have a positive growth rate between 1 to 3 to 4% of its GDP. So that's a key thing to remember. But the interesting observation here is how come the lockdown measures in Western Europe did not seem to have worked as well as the lockdown measures in East Asia. And generally speaking, with a large number of academic journals that have been published so far, there are two major factors that affected the effectiveness of social distancing, masking, and lockdown measures. That is the first, the implementation of the government lockdown measures. That is how effective government implementation is on the government level. And the second is how the public, how cooperative the public is with the government measure, as well as how aware the public is with social distancing and masking. So there seems to be also a cultural element going on in all of this, in impacting the effectiveness of the various measures to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. And so has been a lot of debate as to so this pandemic has shed new light on the cultural differences between, say, the East and, say, the West. That is, there seems to be a qualitative cultural difference in a crisis situation, in a crisis scenario such as this one, that when you have high levels of public awareness and that when people are willing to sort of transition from an individualistic mindset to a more collective mindset that is be very flexible with the circumstances of the moment, there seems to be a higher level of success in combating the virus. Whereas if the cultural mode of a society is strictly based on the individualistic mindset, the effectiveness of the measures seem to have been negatively impacted. So that's an interesting observation. And an interesting observation between the East and the West. So, but outside this lockdown versus not lockdown debate, there's also the debate within East Asia. And that is, for example, South Korea has a very high population density vis-a-vis China. But South Korea did not take comprehensive lockdown measures that China took initially and Western Europe took later on. So the South Korean example has been viewed as a very successful model for a lot of countries to go after, to emulate. Although I think we can all agree that the emulation of other countries has largely failed, but the South Korea still serves as a good example of what a responsive government response looks like without large measures of lockdown. And I think the key part here to learn from the South Korean example is that although both governments both in South Korea and China used a lot of digital technology such as monitoring, contact tracing, large-scale contact tracing, enforced contact tracing for both people traveling into South Korea from outside and traveling into China from outside, and also daily screening and 14-day quarantine. With the implementation of these measures, South Korea was able to avoid large-scale lockdown. But the key part here is that the South Korean public was also very cooperative with was also very trustful with the South Korean government. So a high level of trust between the people and the government, which is shared in both South Korea and China, seems to be another factor influencing the effectiveness of the COVID-19 combat measures. So that's another key part. And another myth that we have heard, another point we have heard over the past month in social media is that countries and regions like New Zealand, Iceland, and Taiwan seem to have dealt with the virus relatively well, and that their actions should be an exemplary that the rest of the world should emulate. There is actually various points of fallacies and incongruencies in that presentation, in that statement, from a scientific point of view. The predominant rejection of that statement, if you ask most people, is that those countries are too small to be an example applicable on a larger scale to larger countries like the US and other more densely populated countries. But that's not even the key question. The key point to understand about the spread of any pandemic, the spread of any epidemic and any virus, is that there are two stages, two phases of transmission. The first is, if you're not the country of origin, that is, any country outside China, if you're not the country of origin, the first stage of transmission, of prevention, is to try to stop the human flow. Basically, if you shut down the airports, shut down the roads connecting to other countries, shut down the roads and shut down the ports, you will basically be able to have, you'll be able to contain any and prevent any spread of the virus into your country. And if you are an island like New Zealand, an island like Taiwan, an island like Iceland, the first stage of prevention is relatively easy. As long as you shut down the airports, curb travelers from outside the island, you can pretty much contain and prevent outside spread, outside invasion of the virus. However, there's also a second stage. And the second stage is, once the virus has reached inside your population, has got onto your island, how do you do it? And here is the main challenging part for these island governments. For example, in New Zealand, it was widely celebrated that they had 100 days of no local COVID transmission. But that came first at the easily implemented measure of basically closing down the airport. Because once they do that, that could easily be done. And that was even also achieved by US President Donald Trump when he suspended all the flights from China in March. So that is actually a relatively easy measure to take. The key performance indicator of how effective the government has been in dealing with the virus is not in the first stage of the spread from outside the country, but rather what has it done when the virus reaches your territory. And because that's the challenging part. So even with that, the Iceland, with a population of 300,000 people, they had early surges of positive cases. But once they shut down the airports and outside human traffic into Iceland, they relatively easily, very quickly curbed the epidemic. And the same case applies to New Zealand. So as you can see, these countries' cases are not really applicable to many other countries which have very close many neighboring countries, many more international airports compared to Taiwan, New Zealand, and Iceland. So the lesson here is do not confuse the relative no case celebration with the scientific and effectiveness of the government measures. That's a very important part, because we do have to recognize that for these two countries, they are exceptions to the rules. That they do have geographically, they are very geographically different, and in terms of the isolation, in terms of their location, they are very different, as well as their population density. So the key point of focus here is still on what happens when the virus reaches inland, as in the case of North America and Western Europe. And so that is basically how the whole world has dealt with the coronavirus so far. But there's another thing that is whether or not a country's political system politicizes the scientific facts of the virus is also a very important indicator of how well the public in that country deals with the epidemic. Because once an issue is politicized, facts don't matter anymore. And that is a sign of a decaying civil society. And that would be very unfortunate in a crisis situation such as this one. So here we have talked about a few factors affecting the effectiveness of counter virus measures that have been taken from various parts of the world. And I just want to end this part of the podcast with the example of Sweden. That is, the herd immunity still is not proven. And the only way to prove it is when you have over 60% of the population infected. And so far, as we can see, a few weeks ago, Sweden has reversed its herd immunity measures, and that would have served the lesson to the rest of the world. Right now, the major hope is to wait for the vaccine, which should come out from various companies, both in North America, in Europe, and in Asia, to provide a cure to the whole world. And that would be the key focus point from now on. And so in terms of the progress and the events that have happened in COVID-19 pandemic so far, I think one lesson that we have learned, one observation that we could make, is that the media coverage plays a huge role in how the government and the public perceive the threat of an event, the threat of an object, and the threat of a situation. And that is, if the media politicizes the issue, portrays it as merely as a bipartisan game, or merely as a us versus them, as in the case of US versus China game, then the public awareness would not necessarily increase. And when you have a press that actually politicizes the issue rather than educate the public, that's when the second part, that is the public awareness and public compliance of social distancing and masking, fails. I think that would be the key lesson. But we also see the misrepresentations in English media in other events outside the COVID pandemic that have been going on over the past 1 year or two as well. And here we can shift our gears a little bit towards the situation that we have going on between the US and China, and namely the two great powers in the world. That is the US, the dominant global power, some would say hegemon, and some would say the only superpower in the world currently, and China, which many predict to be the next superpower in the world, together with the US. So we might see a bipolar world in future between the US and China. And the competition between these two countries marks a major shift in the global power dynamics, which for the past over half a century have been dominated by the victors of the Second World War, primarily the US, who supported the European allies and the Soviet Union in the fight against the Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. So that was the system, the heritage of the World War II about 70 years ago. And 70 years later, after the victory of the allies of the war, the global power dynamics have changed very drastically. That is, you have the world's most populous country, with the most population, rising as its standards of living improve domestically, and its global influence, hard power as well as soft power, increasing very quickly as well. And then you have the situation with the current incumbent superpower, the US, feeling a sense of threat, feeling threatened by the rise of the East Asian country. So when that happens, you necessarily fall, as many historians have pointed out, into what is called the Thucydides trap. And that is when which predates back to ancient Greece, when the rise of Athens threatened the security of Sparta, which led to the Peloponnesian War. So the same situation might happen between the US and China. But without getting too much into the grand picture of things, we can focus on a specific series of issues as to what exactly the two are fighting with each other. And because and you don't know this, but 70% of my TikTok followers are American. So therefore, a lot of my content has been American-centric. That is, I have to make content in a way that can relate to the typical American experience. That is, the subjects that my content touches on have to sort of, in a way, touch those hot button keywords that Americans generally have. So the keywords that Americans have grown familiar with over the past 2 years are keywords like Xinjiang, Uyghur, Hong Kong, Huawei, 5G. So these hot button keywords. So we can just narrow down and drill down into these several subjects for exploring the what's going on between the U.S.-China competition, as well as how that's going to happen, what kind of impact that's going to leave to the rest of the world. So in terms of Xinjiang, not only is it an issue of U.S.-China competition, but also it's an issue of religious conflict. It's an issue of civil society. It's also an issue of ethnic, so to speak, disharmony. Because about 50%, more than about 60% of the population in the western region of Xinjiang is Muslim, is dominated by Muslim, consisting of various ethnic minorities in Western China, ranging from Uyghurs to Kazakhs to Kyrgyzstani people with Kyrgyzstani heritage, and so on. So there's a lot of people, Muslims in Western China, in the region of Xinjiang. And that has been an ongoing issue in China for about the past century or so, as to how to, because Middle Asia, that is the Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and the various Middle Asian states have direct bordering with the Middle East. That is, their population is also Muslim dominant and with a lot of influence over what's happening in Western China. But a very curious case of what's happening in China is also how it presents a different mode of fighting terrorism. Now, this is a very hard nut to crack, because terrorism is not something that generally people in America and in the West associate with what's happening in Xinjiang. When people in these parts of the world think of terrorism, they usually just link it to Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, maybe Libya, and then various other fundamental Islamic extremists that have linked to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. That is their impression. So that is a very difficult situation for making videos like this. That is, when you have your audience who are not familiar with the association you are making, how do you educate them and present them with new information in a way that doesn't make them comfortable and would make them receptive to the new information and facts? So that is what I'm trying to do here. So, and by saying that what's happening in Western China, in Xinjiang, actually presents a new mode of dealing with terrorism, what I mean is, so far there are two modes of dealing with terrorism globally. The first, obviously, is what happens after the 9/11, and we just passed we are right in the middle of the 19th anniversary of the 9/11, and I'm sure many of you have mourned for what happened to the US, and the rest of the world mourns together for you. So after 9/11, the basic tactic and strategy employed by the US, for example, the leader in counterterrorism effort after 9/11, was to basically invade two countries where terrorists were believed to be in existence. That is Iraq and Afghanistan, and the wars are still going on in those two countries. And there has been a relatively large, high degree of success, so to speak, that even though with the insurgence of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, right now ISIS has gone, and also after a few years, 2 decades of the counterterrorism effort, globally the number of terrorist attacks seems to have to gone down. That is, despite the invasion, there has been a relative degree of success. However, the downside of this invasive method of fighting terrorism has been obviously a lot of resentment from the Muslim population to these invasion forces, as well as the backlash from the public of the US, sort of this xenophobia against the Muslims. That is, there's this stereotype that a lot of Muslims are still terrorists. So there's this interesting interplay of cultural perceptions and the negative impact going on culturally as a result of the invasive method of countering terrorism. In terms of China and Xinjiang, the way they have taken to counterterrorism has been rather different. So the history of terrorism in Xinjiang and in Middle Asia, Central Asia, has been an interesting one. The key part of the origin, the cradle of conflicts and terrorism here is, as we all know, Afghanistan. As the Soviet Union invaded the country, the region in the 80s with the remarkable failure and withdrawal later. But then that led to the creation of Mujahideen, the arming of Islamic extremists in Afghanistan fighting against the Soviet with support from the US. But here's also a part that a lot of people don't know, that China, because the US-China relations started to normalize beginning with Kissinger's secret visit from Pakistan to China in early 70s, the two countries maintained a relatively friendly degree posture with each other. And that is why China actually helped the US, assisted the US effort in training and supplying armaments to Mujahideen fighting against the Soviets, because the common enemy then was the Soviet Union. The US and China were on the same side. So the Chinese brought some Mujahideen and Islamic extremists to Xinjiang, who actually were trained by the Chinese forces. So that brought a lot of extremist religious influence into that part of China, which otherwise wouldn't have existed. That was in the 80s. And after the Afghanistan invasion of the Soviet Union was completed with utter failure on the part of the USSR, the obvious consequence was that those extremists remained very well armed by mostly American effort and partially the Chinese support. So China made a strategic mistake there in getting itself involved in that region and bringing later known as unwanted religious influence into Western China, extreme thoughts. And as China gradually opened up, Saudi Arabian money flowed into Xinjiang, China, and the rise of Wahhabism started in Xinjiang. That is an extreme Islamic branch of religious thought, Wahhabism. And also, as China opened up economically and to some degree politically, a lot of imams in Western China, the leaders of the local Muslim communities, traveled to the place they always wanted to travel to, Mecca. they went to Saudi Arabia for their pilgrimage as pilgrims, and brought back a lot of teachings, Islamic teachings that would inevitably be different from the Islamic teachings they have been learning and teaching in China. That is obviously even among the Muslim population from Indonesia to Western China to Central Asia to Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Middle East. Obviously, like any other religion, Islamic teachings vary from country to country and region to region. So when the Chinese imams from Western China went to Saudi Arabia for the pilgrimage, the knowledge they brought back, imagine yourself for the first time in your life, you're finally here in Mecca as a pilgrim, Muslim pilgrim. And then you are in this sacred place where a lot of people are telling you that what you have, the Islamic teachings you have in your place, in your country, in your community there, outside Mecca, is wrong. What we have here in Mecca is the real Islamic teaching that you should follow. Naturally, a lot of these imams are going to follow what was being taught in Saudi Arabia. So Wahhabism, as a result of the increasing cultural and religious exchanges between Western China and Saudi Arabia, rose very rapidly in China, predominantly among the Uyghurs. And the reason predominantly among the Uyghurs is that Uyghurs are the largest part of the Islamic population and the largest population in Xinjiang, consisting up to 50% of the Xinjiang population, about 11 million Uyghurs, between 8 and 11 million people. So Uyghurs were the first population, was the first group of ethnic group to experience to have the rise of Wahhabism. And as a result of that, between the 1990s and early 2010s, the terrorist attacks launched in the name of of Allah, of the Islamic fundamentalism, increased very rapidly. You have it going all the way from Xinjiang, including Uyghur terrorists launching attacks, machete attacks, bomb attacks, and fire attacks against its own Uyghur people with different Islamic understanding of what the religion said, as well as the fundamentalist Uyghurs launching attacks on Chinese Han, therefore making it not just an intra-religious conflict, as well as a inter-ethnicity conflict between the Uyghurs and the Han. And that spillover effect expanded to the rest of China, as there was a serious machete attack that killed dozens of people in Yunnan in early 2010s. And since then, since after then, the central government as well as the government of the Xinjiang Autonomous Region had started to take a much harder stance against the subversion activities in Western China, and that marked what we now known as a lot of Uyghur problems, and how what Western media attributes to the oppressive measures taken by the Chinese Communist Party against the Uyghurs and against the Uyghurs. So that was the source of everything that we have in the English media going on right now. So that was the origin. And China's intensified effort over the past 5 years has led to a lot of reports in outlets like New York Times and various other English sources that the Chinese government is conducting cultural genocide, that Xinjiang is an open-air prison, with a lot of videos popping up on YouTube from these media outlets showing first satellite images of what are claimed to be concentration camps of Uyghur Muslims, and also these various visits into these so-called concentration camps. The first part about the cultural genocide description of Xinjiang is grossly inaccurate, as there are many American, and it is inaccurate not in the sense that some parts of the facts that the Western media has presented are not are not accurate. Some part of it is factual, that there has been more and more stringent measures taken against the Muslim population, but the cultural genocide elements is grossly exaggerated and inaccurate and false, because given the current estimate of 1 to 3 million Uyghur Muslims in those camps, or who have been in those camps, that at most constitute about, say, 1 million, about 10% of the Uyghur population. So what happens with the rest of the Uyghur population? There's no mention of that in the Western media at all. And if you go to Xinjiang today, you will see them just freely roaming the street, no problem, in both northern and southern Xinjiang. In southern Xinjiang, it's a bit tougher, but because that was the hub of terrorism, and that was where it borders Afghanistan, where the terrorism activity is sourced from. But anyway, even the numbers, and here comes the crux of the issue, the number 1 to 3 million Uyghur Muslims being locked in concentration camps, being forced to brainwash their mind. The number comes from two studies, one done by this Western scholar named Adrian Zenz, who interviewed in the study a total of 8 people in 8 different Xinjiang villages to produce the estimates. A total of 8 people's estimates produced the number 1 to 3 million, and the other report was funded by the U.S. government, purely based on anecdotal evidence. The second part of the media corroboration with the number came from the satellite images of the new buildings popping up in Western China, in Xinjiang. Now, I've visited a lot of those websites showing the satellite images of the new buildings in Xinjiang. So far, I have seen no direct proof of that. First, they are these retraining camps, and second, they could, because they could just be regular buildings, construction happening in China, in Xinjiang, because China is building a lot of new buildings, infrastructure at all times. So first, there is no direct evidence saying that those are these schools or camps at all. And the second is, even if they were, the numbers could still be grossly exaggerated simply by the virtue of the fact that when you see the satellite images, the construction and the building looks very empty, but you see nobody on the ground, nobody elsewhere or around it. That there could be just another thing for some future projects in the local community. So the evidence there is very weak. But in terms of this cultural genocide, here comes the major freedom afforded to a foreign press that reports on a foreign country with its audience being largely unaware of what's going on in that foreign country, who don't speak that local language, and who probably will never visit, who probably will never be in that foreign country to see for themselves. And that is the freedom afforded to a foreign press reporting on foreign issues, because there is no check and balance, there's no verification, there's no peer review of these media reports done by this foreign press on other countries. That is, they have the monopoly of information of what their audience, of what their domestic audience believes. And when that happens, you have sort of a corrupted press reporting on issues in a way that it could distort however it wants. And that is a power, and that is a problem in international reporting these days. So given all that, the cultural genocide part is especially distorted, because in China, the tourist industry in West China relies on the cultural diversity of the various ethnic minorities living in that part of China. Because without the diversity, there will just be another place like the rest of China, and the local economy will be hurt. So when you consider that, what would be the incentive for the Chinese government and local officials to eradicate this diversity of cultures? there is no, there is the argument there is just economically it doesn't make sense at all. So just from these several angles, which are never covered in Western media, and the only American news agency that covers these facts that are reported by other mainstream American media is the agency called Gray Zone. And the Gray Zone has, in my opinion, done a fantastic job in exposing the facts that would otherwise remain unknown to the Western audience, presumably forever. That these facts would simply be buried if Gray Zone did not did its fair, excellent job of investigating journalism and educating the Western audience and English-speaking audience who don't visit China, who don't speak Chinese, on these issues. So here I believe, and also I will post all of these sources to the video description after this live stream for your reference. You will have free access to all of this information to form your own judgment. So Free Zone has done an excellent job in terms of all this. And the second one, and here's the issue of Xinjiang. So the larger question of why, and even in the 90s, even just as recently as a few years ago, the U.S. military forces fought together alongside the Chinese forces in Western China in Xinjiang against the terrorists in Afghanistan. They were joint effort militarily to fight terrorists there, but that is never covered in Western media. So this is the story of fighting counterterrorism in Western China that has been sort of distorted into this cultural genocide story by a lot of English and American media. However, on a grand scale, when we compare these two methods of dealing with terrorism, the first being the invasive method and the second being the re-education method, and I should say here that those re-education schools exist for the reason for re-educating the Islamic extremists into and try to teach them vocational skills back so they can adapt in normal society. Because from the Chinese point of view, the reason they were converted to Islamic extremism was that they saw no hope or a lack of opportunity in the society they were living in. So the Chinese perspective goes along the lines of once you give them the skills with which they could provide for themselves and feel valuable as an individual, as a part of society, they would get out of the extremist mindset themselves. That's what the re-education, the word re-education means in that context from the Chinese perspective. And so far, since 2015 or 16, China has experienced no terrorist attack, zero terrorist attack in any part of China because of these measures. Now, some of the measures sometimes could go over the top because there have been people who are simply associated with foreign accounts in China, Uyghur, that are being held for investigation. And so I think it is fair to make the argument that the Chinese government in some areas has taken some, so to speak, extreme measures to excessively and very extremely cautious measures that they want to do it as comprehensively as possible. But overall, in terms of the story of cultural genocide and eliminating the Uyghur population increased fivefold, if not more, over the past years. And I will cite that study and cite the number in a link later in the video description as well. The Uyghur population increased far more than the Han population. And one-child policy was never applied during the old communist regime in China to the ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs. It was only applied to the Han Chinese. And even now, with the allowance of 2 children per family, that is also not applied to ethnic minorities. So the population of the Uyghur in China has increased drastically, far faster than the Han Chinese. So this story of cultural genocide, this effort by Western media and English media to draw a parallel between what the Nazi Germany did to the Jewish people in Europe and what the Chinese government did to combat Islamic extremists in Western China, is, without the slightest exaggeration, preposterous, irresponsible, and journalistic, and a blatant example of a lack of journalistic integrity. And that is the failure of this so-called free press. So and going back to what I was just starting to talk about, comparing these two measures of combating terrorism, I don't know if either of them is perfect. I don't think at this stage of human development and human civil society, we have reached the stage where we have a satisfactory way to deal with religious extremism and terrorism. I think neither of these two measures are perfect, because one, you invade another country and you bring back the terrorists for torture in an island offshore in the Caribbean for torture, for inhuman treatment, and the other, you lock inside these buildings these Islamic extremists and try to re-educate them and give them skills and don't allow them to don't allow them the sort of freedom that normal people would. So I don't think either of this measure is perfect, but I do think that the invasion method, the consequence of arousing hatred among the Middle Easterners against America, that was a cost that the re-education method in China will not in danger. We will not engender in China, and I think the ethnic conflict between and the religious conflict in Western China will die down very soon, because it was not an invasive method like the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. But either way, I don't think either of these two measures are perfect. And I think the overall issue of dealing with terrorism is a very tricky one, because I mean, even in societies like even in France, if burqa should be allowed on the street, it has been a huge debate, and it's henceforth been banned. So even that might be seen by some as a violation of individual freedom and human right. So I don't think there will ever be a perfectly satisfactory answer to solve the fight against terrorism, because sometimes it's just useless to re-educate terrorists, and also it might be a religious issue that that because of the if information asymmetry going on in different parts of the different branches of the religious teaching, some ignorance and misinterpretations of religious texts will always exist. So that's basically the situation in Xinjiang. And there will obviously, this subject could make videos of hours and hours, and leave your questions in the comment section if you have one, and we'll definitely come back to this in another video to address some of the details of what's happened in this topic. And the second part of and the third topic in this podcast stream that have the undertone of the U.S.-China relations is Hong Kong. And that is the U.S. misportrayal of what's happening in Xinjiang, geopolitically speaking, can be viewed as an attempt to disrupt China's Belt and Road Initiative to connect China with Central Asian countries, Russia, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe in the land route. And its sea route is much more different, but overall, Xinjiang is a key part of that path from China all the way to Western Europe. And once that's disrupted, half of the Chinese plan in Belt and Road Initiative can be disrupted. So once that is done, China's globalization effort, namely the Belt and Road Initiative, could be hugely negatively affected. But in terms of the issue with Hong Kong, the city of Hong Kong in China still plays a large role in its economic development, namely that there's a lot of international companies in Hong Kong, and overall, because of its development after the Second World War, it's basically been the beacon of commerce and international trade, and its main competitor is Singapore. So in Southeast Asia and East Asia, these two cities play the dominant role of facilitating international commerce and trade, Singapore and Hong Kong. So that is the place of Hong Kong in China, which it would be very hard to be replaced by other cities like Xinjiang, because the role of Hong Kong is just uniquely in its history as well as its capabilities, politically speaking, language-wise speaking, culturally speaking, and economically speaking. So Hong Kong's place is very difficult to usurp in replacement of other Chinese cities and other cities in other Southeast Asian countries. So the place of Hong Kong is very important to China. And if that is disrupted, if Hong Kong is closed down as a result of all these protests, China's economic competitiveness can be very much affected, negatively affected. And the incentive to disrupt Chinese economic growth is almost a matter of public record, and that because of China's rapid growth, almost average 10% a year GDP growth in 35 years, and recently it's been slowing down. The incentive for a lot of foreign countries to disrupt China's growth cannot be overstated. That there is plenty of incentive to try to slow down Chinese economy in various ways, and Hong Kong can be seen as one way to do it. Just like Xinjiang's role in Belt and Road Initiative can be seen as a very significant way to curb Chinese economy. So Hong Kong, and so instability and social chaos in Hong Kong would play a huge matter, can play an important role in limiting China. But then there's economics aside, and Hong Kong, economically speaking, has been experienced economic stagnation, not stagnation, but certain slowing growth in past years, because the primary economic problem in Hong Kong is that young people cannot afford housing. That, like the US economy to a certain extent, the Hong Kong economy is largely financialized. That is, financial industry is huge. So the actual economy, say the manufacturing, the other parts of the economy, and the wealth created by the financial industry is not distributed to the rest of the population. Pretty similar to what's happening in the US in terms of how Wall Street has exploited the American economy. And because of that, in Hong Kong, young people these days face a similar situation as the young people in America, that they cannot afford housing, like American college students who have huge college debts, as well as for the first time in American history, are going to experience a worse standard of living compared to their parents in American history. The Hong Kong people seem to be going down the same path. So there's a fair amount of hopelessness, economically speaking, in the Hong Kong society. And even though Hong Kong has claimed several spots of the top 100 universities, Hong Kong and Chinese University, Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and Hong Kong University, the young people there still might not see a lot of economic benefits, even with a degree from prestigious higher education institutions. So that's a problem. So when there is dissatisfaction there, a vent is needed. a way out is needed for that dissatisfaction to be expressed. And this culminated in the protests following the attempt of the Hong Kong government to have an extradition bill passed between Hong Kong and mainland China. And the reason for the bill, for the proposal of the bill, was that there was a Hong Kong, there was a Taiwanese or Hong Kong, I think, citizen that committed a crime, but could not be trialed, could not be placed on trial in Hong Kong because of the slow legal processes of Hong Kong, because Hong Kong's legal process still is still the British goes along the lines of the British legal process, which takes very long. So that person could not be trialed for committing the crime, and the only place where he could be tried was in mainland China. But such an extradition bill did not exist, so that couldn't take place. And the solution of the Hong Kong government to solve the problem was by proposing a new extradition bill between mainland China and Hong Kong. So when that took place, huge protests broke out in Hong Kong, as a lot of people saw this as an authoritarian request of the mainland Chinese government on the local Hong Kong government to end Hong Kong's autonomous status. Whereas in fact, it was proposed by the Hong Kong government, not the mainland government. So the protest has been going on for months and so far almost 2 years. So when that's happened, and as a result, the Hong Kong economy was hugely hit. The retail industry was decimated, and a lot of businesses were forced to close down, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And tourism was hugely decimated as a result of the protest, and Hong Kong economy took a dip last year as well as this year. So the protests, unlike the Black Lives Matter protests that's going on in the US, have been sort of violent to an extent unimaginable, as you have seen on the news that that Hong Kong protesters have been teaching Black Lives Matter protesters how to fight against the police. However, the response from the police, the reaction from the police in these two regions in Hong Kong and the US respectively has been very different. Zero casualty in Hong Kong, zero death in Hong Kong. I'll give the more specific number, but the casualties in Hong Kong protests are very low compared to the US, which are very, very high. So the restraint of the Hong Kong police has been something that's very different compared to the American police. But overall, this is a brief overview of what's been happening in Hong Kong. But overall, the key issue in Hong Kong is this. China mainland ultimately is a one-party state. That is, it doesn't have universal suffrage in terms of universal political one man, one vote. And Hong Kong has a colonial history in which every resident of Hong Kong was a subject of the British monarch, and the governor of Hong Kong had always been appointed by the British government in London. So right now, after the return of Hong Kong to China in 1997, there's been a debate ongoing as to what the future of Hong Kong is. Because in Hong Kong, there was a history of no democracy, whereas in mainland China, there is this electoral democracy either. So this pursuit of the Hong Kong people for democracy sort of turned into, so the initial protest against the extradition bill eventually turned into this protest for one man, one vote. And now it's important to give context of what the political system in Hong Kong looks like. The political system in Hong Kong has improved compared to the British colonial rule before 1997, in that there is a lot of elections going on in different ways for people to elect the local representatives. Although the people do not directly elect the head of the Hong Kong autonomous government, special administrative region government, the head of the government, it does elect, and the local public do elect various levels of local representatives. So that's an improvement compared to the colonial Hong Kong. But the question is, will Hong Kong transition into a system of electoral democracy where one man, one vote, all the way leading up to the head of the government level will be implemented? That is the question. Now, that would go back to the intricacy of the one country, two system. So the one country, two system model for a long time has placed an emphasis on respecting the Hong Kong autonomous status, special administrative status, in that its system is still fundamentally different from that of the mainland China. But in the past couple of years, this protest for electoral democracy in Hong Kong has turned into a separatist movement to a large degree, as a lot of people were waving American and British flags on the streets of Hong Kong, trying to separate it from China and become an independent country. Now, regardless of the question of if Hong Kong will be an electoral democracy in future, under the one country, two system model, separatism will not be allowed. Separatism is considered a breach of the contract of the one country, two system. Whether or not the question of electoral democracy and increasing political enfranchisement in Hong Kong is another question, but separatism is out of the question. It's out of the blank. Will never be taken seriously in China, and that is the problem. So when you have this separatist group as part of the Hong Kong protest, the national government cannot simply have them going on in a long-term basis. Just as the national government of Spain will not have the Catalonian protest for Catalonia independence as an independent country separate from Spain to happen. So, and we have seen the separatist movement in various countries all the time that you have in California, in Texas, because they are very big economies and very well-off economies. A lot of Californians and Texans have been campaigning for separating from the Union and becoming independent states. But overall, the request for separatism in Hong Kong, is unacceptable both to the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government. And in order to quell down the protest and the violence, the Hong Kong government tried to implement a Hong Kong security law, but it failed. It tried to do it in 2003, and in recent months, because of the unrest, it's unable to propose a new bill. So it requested help from the central government again. The central government of China did not just go in there and play its own cards. The help was requested from the Hong Kong government to the central government, and the central government, after consulting with the Hong Kong representatives, helped draft the Hong Kong security law, and that was passed in Hong Kong. So that was the question, and for a lot of references, I will place links by people like George Galloway, the British intellectual, as well as some other YouTubers who have talked about this issue in the video description as links after this video. So that is the Hong Kong issue, and the key and the bottom line of the Chinese government and China with Xinjiang, with respect to Xinjiang and Hong Kong, is this: that it will not allow these two places become either a new harbor for terrorism or a separate country from China. That is, it will not tolerate separatism. Neither will it allow to be a place of chaos where social order is undermined, is compromised. because the philosophy of the Chinese economic growth model has always been, this is the mindset of the Chinese, that only stability will produce growth, will produce development. Without the stability factor, all other progress proposed is useless. That's the Chinese mindset. So China will try to maintain stability in its various parts of its landmass very, very hardly. They will try to do whatever it takes. That is the Chinese mindset. And all of this can be reflected in the shutdown of the US consulate in Chengdu as a Chinese retaliatory action against the US shutting down the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas. So because the US consulate in Chengdu has been responsible for conducting surveys and information collecting in western part of China. So every consulate of every country in another country has a specific region that is responsible for. So for the consulate of the US consulate in Chengdu, that consulate was responsible for collecting information and spying. As we all know, spying is basically a natural element of a consulate, of a foreign embassy. But anyway, the Chengdu consulate was responsible for doing that in western part of China. That is, a lot of the insurgency activities in Xinjiang could be attributed to the US consulate in Chengdu. As I'm sure there will be a no lack of similar activities, such as spying and information collection of the Chinese consulate in Houston. This is a public record. This is a well-known knowledge in the intelligence communities that it could be somehow considered news in the English media is actually somehow surprising, because everyone knows that these consulates, these embassies have these sort of activities, have had them going on for a long time. So anyway, that was the Hong Kong problem. So stitching all of these together in a grand scale of things, we can relate to the trade war as well. We can relate to the ban of Huawei, because all of these efforts have been a manifestation of the ongoing US-China tension. So when you consider all of these factors together, and these are the three subjects that I want to do as the main focus of this podcast. That is, we have covered the COVID-19 pandemic and how it was politicized and how different countries responded to it differently, and the Hong Kong and the Xinjiang issue, as well as the Hong Kong issue. So hopefully these three subjects have given you a lens into the sort of government activities that are typical in a conflict situation, in a competition situation between great powers such as this. And these three events basically categorize what has been happening since the beginning of 2020. That is, a lot of the conflicts, including the Huawei ban, on the technological front, and the trade and the trade conflict on the economic front, have been simply manifestations of the ongoing conflict between the US and China. China doesn't really want to fight, because for the longest time it was a beneficiary of globalization, not in the same way that US was a beneficiary of the globalization process, because although the US economy grew fivefold since the Chinese opening up, the wealth created by the trade between the two countries was mainly captured by the Wall Street. That the Wall Street investors made massive investment in many parts of the world and made a lot of money in the stock market, but the working class and the manufacturing towns of America were sort of abandoned by the elitist agenda, elitist Wall Street agenda. So the US benefited from globalization in a different way, that although it also created huge wealth, fivefold of economic increase, that wealth did not reach the bottom layers of American society, and that was the problem. And that's why we have seen this this American backlash against China, because because the U.S. fundamentally views China. Fundamentally views that China would be hurt more by the decoupling, by the end of globalization than the U.S. Whereas we all know the U.S. is the largest market in the world, with a lot of purchasing power. So with decoupling, there's a lot of questions remain to be answered, and that's why the U.S. has been trying to urging its European and other allies to form a stance against China. That is the main background of 2020. And I understand that this video has been in no way a comprehensive analysis of what's happened in 2020. But hopefully these three subjects, that of COVID-19, the political dynamics behind COVID-19, that of Xinjiang and that of Hong Kong, have given you a window and a set of tools, more importantly, a set of tools for you to analyze what's going to happen afterwards. And so, but for the technological competition in terms of 5G and the further trade competition, the further trade conflicts between the two countries, as well as the rest of the world response, as well as the technological transformation that I promised to talk about, I think those will be the subjects of our next episode. So as we draw to a close, I will answer some of the questions. I will answer some of the questions that I've collected from our TikTok videos. And let's see. And if you have any questions, post in the comment section. So the first question is, what are the technologies, in my opinion, that will define the next 10 years of human development outside AI? So what technologies other than AI do I think will define the next 10 years of human development? Okay, that is an interesting question that we haven't been able to cover in this episode. In terms of technological transformation of human society, one thing that hasn't happened yet is that for the vast population in Africa, that is the next epicenter of human wealth creation, manufacturing, and improvement in standard of living and poverty alleviation. In that part of the world, the lack of infrastructure first, and then also the banking system in supporting the economic growth has largely remained underdeveloped. So financial technology, together with mobile internet, will help make the traditional financial infrastructure built up in Africa sort of unnecessary. So financial technology will be an important part in transforming human society and increase mobility. And that also is linked to digital currency proposed by various countries, as well as Bitcoin. And I think it'll be interesting to see how cryptocurrencies will play out in future. And that's one area outside AI. And another area is robotics, as well as space technology. And exactly how that's going to transform human society remains unknown. But we will talk about the technological aspect of change in a future episode. Thank you for your question. The next question is, will China move towards a more centralized system like the old communist China? Okay, that is a question that has been asked by many, as especially after the abolishment of term limits by the Chinese president in 2000. So that because the abolishment of term limits appeared to many to be a reversal of the Chinese political system to a model that more resembles cultural revolution. The interesting piece of evidence that will contradict this centralized model of thinking is that in 2004, in the 13th plenary session of the Chinese Politburo, it was confirmed that the market will play the decisive role of determining the Chinese social development and the decisive role in Chinese society. And that means the Chinese government will not try to exert comprehensive control, getting its hands too much involved in the economic capitalistic elements of Chinese society. So that is confirmed. And so, but in terms of how the dynamics between the government and the private sector is going to evolve, there is a lot to be talked about. But so I'll put that better in mind for a future episode as well. In an episode where we can create a single episode just to talk about the future of the Chinese political system. Okay, this is a comment, and I thought I would just respond to it. And I think the comment was referring to the Uyghur situation in Xinjiang. The comment says, "What is to one group terrorism is freedom fighters to another group." Well, this is a tricky case, isn't it? Because you have who were the terrorists in Xinjiang during 9/11 and during the terrorist bomb attacks in London and Paris, fighting freedom for, campaigning for freedom. Like, those terrorists are condemned internationally. And again, I want to just emphasize that I don't think either of the invasive method of countering terrorism and the re-education method of countering terrorism, I don't think either of them is perfect. But just overall, I think it's a tricky situation where these type of comments of saying what is to one group terrorist is freedom fighters to another, I don't think this type of comment is constructive to the conversation at all, and that's my response. Okay. I'll just go through something, the chat window. No, I am on Douyin, but I don't have an account. Okay, so again, I just want to say thank you to my Patreon, to my patrons on Patreon for supporting me this early, and thank you for your trust. And it is because of your support that I've been able to create this podcast. And I will have the Patreon window and icon also linked in the video somewhere in the corner. And also I will have all the sources later post in the video description where you can just have access and do your own research. Okay. Thank you for coming, and I will see you next time and on TikTok.